Cum merge lumea? How the World Works, a collection of interviews and speeches of Noam Chomsky examining some of the most important and difficult questions of US and world history, just hit the shelves a few days ago. The book, published by Curtea Veche, which enjoyed immense success overseas, totaling more than 500,000 copies sold, will most certainly reignite old debates and spark new ones on many questions relevant today. It will most definitely question and transform the immensely idealized image of US democracy and an image cultivated by the mainstream media in Romania and the whole of the Eastern Bloc. To discuss some of these questions and give you a taste of what the book has to offer, I have here with me a very special guest, Professor Noam Chomsky. It is a great honor and pleasure to have you here with me. And I'm most grateful to you for taking your time to talk to me and to your already numerous Romanian readers about some of the ideas discussed in your book.
Very pleased to be with you.
Professor Chomsky, translating this book, I have to tell you from the onset, was very often an instructive experience. Though at times it felt like reading an almost exhaustive inventory of the things found in Pandora's box. And one of the most unsettling things you discuss at length in the book is the way USA used its dominant position in the world after the Second War in order to consolidate its economic and political power. No matter the costs, democracy was good only as long as it served American interests. Human rights were upheld only when it benefited US interests, and so on. My question for you would be, what has changed in the last decades, and why do you think this strategy remained unquestioned by the European allies of America for such a long time, at least until the Iraq War?
First of all, we should recognize that what you describe is simply the way great powers operate. Nothing, I mean, there are of course differences from one to another, but basically they're going to pursue their own interests, very peripheral, if any, concern for human rights, democracy, a lot of rhetoric. And the interests that they pursue are not those of the population, but those of sectors internal to the society that have power and domination. Societies are not egalitarian. Policies aren't made by the public. The public has some degree of influence depending on the country, but anyone you look at, there's centers of concentrated power. We can easily identify them, and they pursue their interests. Things have changed in recent years in many ways. There was a big change in 40 years ago when the neoliberal wave began. This was a program began to be developed in the history goes way back, but it began to take force in the 1970s, the Carter years, where you saw the bare beginning. Then it took off in force with Reagan and Thatcher around 1980. The prime concern, it talks about free markets and so on, but we can put the rhetoric aside. Government grew under Reagan, for example. But the idea is to shift. The idea was encapsulated very clearly in one of Reagan's inaugural address when he was elected. That government is the problem, not the solution. Well, you think for a few minutes, a few seconds. What does that mean? It means we have to take decisions away from government and put them somewhere else. Where is the somewhere else? Private power. So we have to take decisions away from the government, which is at least partially responsive to the population, and put them in the hands of private power, which is totally unaccountable to the population and concerned only with maximizing profit and wealth for itself. That's where decisions have to go. Okay, not hard to, and in fact, actions were taken right away to implement these measures in both the United States and Britain, which pioneered it, then it spread all over the world. So the first thing that Thatcher and Reagan did, almost on taking office, was to move to destroy the labor movement. In the case of Thatcher, by trying to destroy the mine workers, the most militant part of the union movement. In the case of Reagan, by bringing in strike breakers to break strikes. That's, at the time, was illegal in the entire world outside of South Africa, apartheid South Africa. Of course, put aside the Soviet bloc, it's a different story. But Reagan did it, and when he got away with it, corporate sector picked up the idea, figure we can do it too. Since then, both in Britain and the United States, major, especially the US, a major attack on the labor movement barely exists. The other thing is predictably opening the doors to massive concentration of wealth and power in private hands. So by now, for example, take the United States, about 0.1%, not 1%, 0.1% of the population holds about 20% of the wealth. It's about twice what it was when Reagan came in. Meanwhile, for the large majority of the population, things have pretty much stagnated. So about 70% of the workforce can barely get by from one week to another. Well, that's the natural consequence of these decisions. And then, of course, in the last few years under Trump, there have been other dramatic changes. Could go into that.
I think we have enough time to discuss this matter a little bit, but I would be now most interested to understand in how way do you think the fact that, for example, China is more and more emerging as a very as a world power, as a very powerful country, both military and economically, how will this impact the weak states in the Western world? Is this going to lead to reconsideration of this weakening of the states? And I'm referring to America and the powerful states in Europe, of course.
Well, China has grown enormously. It now has a substantial economy. In terms of per capita wealth, it's way below the Western world. In terms of general social and economic progress, you can get a sense by looking at the Human Development Index of the United Nations, which ranks countries by various measures in terms of development, including the economy, including other things. China is about 90th, way down. It's nowhere near the Western world. Europe has the largest economy in the world, larger than the United States. China's, the gross economy is large, but the per capita economy is slight. And furthermore, if you look at other measures which aren't used, like ownership of the world's wealth, who owns the world's wealth? Well, there's some good studies of this. One by a very smart political scientist now in Hong Kong, Sean Stars. What he shows is that about half the world's wealth, is owned by US-based multinational corporations. They're first or second in just about every category: manufacturing, finance, retail, pick it. China's way behind. So China takes Apple computer, the world's biggest enterprise, just passed $2 trillion, broke a record. It's Apple devices, like the one I happen to be using, is assembled in China, but it's assembled under the control of a Taiwanese corporation, Foxconn, which gets a lot of the profit. But the main profit goes right back to the Apple headquarters. China gets something, but a very small percentage of the profit gained by putting together the Apple devices. And that's true for across the board. Now, China is improving. So it's advancing in some areas. It's actually first in the world, like solar panels. Solar is not just scale, but even the advanced technology, the wind turbines, 5G, the new internet standard, higher internet standard. And the United States is concerned about that and is trying to prevent China from developing. It's a very cruel program, but claiming very dubious security reasons. They don't mean much. The United States under Trump is very specifically trying to prevent China's development. In a sane world, it would be cooperating with China in development. So if China can develop advanced internet capacity, we all benefit from it. If China develops better electric vehicles, it's fine for everybody. If China develops a coronavirus vaccine, it's wonderful for the world. The idea of trying to prevent this in order to stay on top is cruel and savage.
So do you think?
Go ahead.
Do you think we're gonna witness such fierce economic wars in the future as a way of the USA to stifle China's development?
If we want to destroy human society, one way to do it is to enter into economic wars. If we want to preserve human society, and even in a better form, a much better form, the right answer is internationalism and cooperation. It's not that the Chinese government is a nice government. It does very rotten things. Other governments too. But that's no reason to try to stop the kind of social and economic development which would benefit not only the people of China, but everyone.
You talk a lot in this book and in many of your talks about the very important role of intellectuals who you say have a duty to expose the abuses of government. And I would like to talk about that, but first I would like us to talk about another role of the intellectuals, namely that of providing a kind of ideological infrastructure that justifies abuses of the government against its own citizens or against other countries. Since you have extensively discussed in your book, in this volume, the overt and covert war U.S. waged in the last few decades on Latin America, I would like to refer to intellectuals such as Lawrence Harrison or Samuel Huntington, who developed Lawrence Harrison or Samuel Huntington. I know over time you had many debates with them, and I would like to ask you, how do you find this idea, which is still very present in many ways among my fellow countrymen and to some extent in the whole of the Eastern Bloc, that underdevelopment is a state of mind, an idea that somehow basically justified the US interventionism on a large scale in Latin America?
Well, if you look at the record of US intervention in Latin America, it's horrendous. For example, just take mainstream scholarship, not my opinion. Take a look at, say, the standard scholarly history of the Cold War, Cambridge history of the Cold War, multi-volume history, very sober, conservative, They have an article on the U.S. And Latin America, of course, written by a highly respected scholar, Coatsworth, Columbia University dean, respected scholar. He points out that since in the post-Stalin era, since roughly the last 60 years or so, the U.S., the massive torture, repression, violence in U.S.-dominated Latin America, it far exceeds what happened in Eastern Europe. And what happened in Eastern Europe was not very pretty. I don't have to tell you about it. But actually, the worst was in Romania, where, as I'm
That's
sure
true.
you know, Ceausescu was a darling of the United States. He was supported by the United States to literally the last minute. And George W. Bush was supporting, H.W. Bush, first Bush, was supporting him until the day he was overthrown by the public. But in Latin America, even including Ceausescu and the rest of them, the record is much worse. And if you look at U.S. commentators who know, like the chief of insurgency for Kennedy and Johnson, Charles Machling was his name, I quote him in the book. He was the head of counterinsurgency in Latin America. He says that Kennedy's decision in 1962 to change the mission of the Latin American military, which the U.S., of course, controls, to change it from hemispheric defense to internal security. Internal security means war against your own population. So that decision in 1962 changed the U.S. attitude from tolerance for the rapacity and terror of the Latin American military into direct participation in crimes of the kind that we remember from Heinrich Himmler. That's the head of counterinsurgency, not some radical for Johnson and Kennedy. And if you look at the record, that's in fact the case. It's a horrifying record. And it's very interesting to look at the question of democracy promotion. It's also discussed in the book. The democracy promotion is a prime part of US government rhetoric. Other countries too, everyone has their own farce. This is the US farce. It's carefully studied. The best studies are by a well-known scholar, Thomas Carruthers, who is a great advocate of democracy promotion. He's a Reaganite. He was in Reagan's State Department in charge of democracy promotion. So he's not discussing it from the left. He's a careful scholar. He's honest. He studies it in Latin America. And he says, the way he puts it is interesting. He says, all American leaders are schizophrenic. They call for democracy promotion, but what they do undermines it consistently. It's a strange thing. You can't understand it. They have some psychological problem. You know? So they all say it's a wonderful thing. They all do everything they can to undermine it. And then he says, well, the reason basically is, I'm almost quoting, the US government wants democracy, but it does not want it to do anything that is inconsistent with US interests and demands. So in other words, democracy is fine as long as you follow our orders. Okay, that's the standard position. Now, the United States is not breaking any new ground on this. If you look back at the British record, French record, it's all the same. You know? So France was carrying out a civilizing mission when the French general in Algeria gave orders to exterminate the population. His words. We're carrying out our civilizing mission. The British were just so magnificent that nobody could understand how wonderful they were when they were destroying India and forcing it to grow opium so that they could hammer their way into China, into the Chinese market. But they're so angelic that nobody could even understand them. In fact, this is just uniform. You see it in a kind of a vulgar form in totalitarian states like the old Soviet Union. There it's right on the surface. You just laugh at it. In the Western countries, it's a little more subtle, so you have to spend a few minutes to take it apart, but it's not very different.
Well, it's a very bleak and discouraging image you paint, reality. I mean, for many people who live in Romania, for many people who were my age when communism ended, this way you characterize America would be unthinkable. The generation of my parents and I would say a large majority of the people in Romania and in other countries from the Eastern Bloc still see the United States of America as a great light spreading out democracy, and they still see Russia as the empire of evil. So for many, this book and many other books of you who have in part been translated into Romanian are like a shock. And it's very hard to believe for somebody who had this image, this idealized image of America, how come all these things can be true? And I always have difficulty in convincing these people that the American democracy is but an empty shell and nothing more.
The most democratic countries, free and democratic countries. There's no correlation. You can be free and democratic internally and violent and murderous outside. So it's always a mixed story. Just take American history. Okay, how did the United States became independent in the 1780s, 250 years ago? One of the main reasons for the American Revolution was that the British, who had been in control, had issued a royal proclamation, 1763, in which they said that the colonists who were part of England and Britain at the time were not allowed to move past the mountain range, the Appalachian mountain range, right at the edge of Pennsylvania, roughly. They were not allowed to move into the Indian territories where the Indian nations ruled. And Britain was protecting the rights of the Indian nations against the colonists. Colonists weren't having that. They wanted to expand to the west. George Washington, father of the nation, was a great land speculator. He wanted to pick up lands in the Indian countries, make money from them, carried out, even during the Revolutionary War, he was carrying out major attacks against the Iroquois. The name among the Iroquois, they called Washington the Town Destroyer. That was the name he was given. Then comes the rest of the 19th century, virtual extermination. The population was virtually eliminated. There were treaties, they were broken, they were exterminated, expelled, and now mostly in reservations, very poor reservations. These were the population of the country. That's one part of the story. Another part of the story was the most vicious system of slavery that ever existed in human history. There had always been one or another form of slavery, but there was nothing comparing with the American South. Absolutely nothing. An entirely new form of slavery. And it never ended. 400 years since the first slaves were brought, still there. It's kind of like a caste structure, like India with the Dalits. They're marked for life. You know? They can change the wording and the laws, but it stays, and it stays the same. White supremacy is a deep-rooted property in the United States. Donald Trump understands that very well. That's why he tries to fan it in every speech he gives, appealing to white supremacy, trying to stimulate it. You take a look at FBI statistics on terror in the United States. There isn't much, but there's some. You go back 10 years, let's say, about 10% of the terror was white supremacist. After 4 years of Trump, it's practically 100%. These messages have impact, and he knows what he's doing. It's not stupid. He has to appeal. His policies are to enrich the wealthy and the powerful. Can't win votes that way. So you have to try to cultivate other issues like racism, white nationalism, guns, whatever you can pick up. And he's a master at that. We see people like that. You see one right near you, Orban in Hungary.
That's true, yeah. Yeah.
It's a phenomenon all over the world.
Yeah, and I would like us.
Nevertheless, the democratic achievements are substantial. Like I'm free to say what I want. The FBI isn't going to come in and arrest me. There is, for people who have a little bit of privilege, which is most of the population, they're quite secure from state repression. Not if you're black and living in a slum.
I agree with you, and you touched a lot of interesting things, and I hope we'll have the time to discuss some of them in length. But I would like to go back to something you said, because I think one can agree that to some extent there is a correlation between the way a country treats other countries and the way it treats its own citizens. And I think you yourself give an argument for this idea when you speak about this phenomenon you call a third worldization of America. And I think that even now, during these Trump years, we see how the American public has become the enemy. I would argue that after a certain point, your own citizens become the internal enemy. And even if there is an internal democracy, it is constantly chipped away, it is constantly eroded by this violence exercised against other countries.
It can happen, but I think you shouldn't take the Trump phenomenon is off the spectrum. He is by no means a normal politician. There's been nothing like him in American history. Nothing. He's a true monster, interested in nothing but himself and wealth and power, and he'll do anything at all to maintain it. He doesn't care one bit about the population. Now that's new. It wasn't true of George W. Bush. It wasn't true of the first Bush. It wasn't true of Reagan, Nixon, none of them. In fact, just take this election. Nixon, not a nice person, basically won the election in 1960. Kennedy won the election by trickery and faked votes and so on. Nixon didn't challenge it. He knew that if he challenged it, he might have won, but he said he just didn't want to tear the country apart. Cared more about the country than winning an election. Take Al Gore in 2000. The election was stolen. Go through the details. Yeah. But he said he's not going to challenge it. Again, the same reasons. So that's a far-right Republican, liberal Democrat had the same view. Take Trump. He's already announced that he's not going to accept the election if he doesn't win. He doesn't care. He doesn't care about the country. He doesn't care about anything. He's, he's people call him a fascist, but that gives him much too much credit. Fascism was a serious ideology that's way above his pay grade. What he's like is a kind of a tin pot dictator in a small neo-colony where the government gets overthrown every couple of years by the military. Approximately what he's turning the country into. But this is way off the spectrum. It's not the normal case. If he wins another 4 years, it could become permanent.
Well, what's really disconcerting for me and for the people I talked with about this, about what's happening in America right now, and I agree with everything you said about Trump, with your characterization of Trump, but I think what is very disconcerting is the fact that the American institutions, at least some of them, the Republican Party, cowered to Trump. The fact that he was able to change prosecutors, and he was able to, what's happening right now with the Postal Service, for example. He's trying to steal the election by naming a postal master who is boycotting, who is destroying, dismantling the Postal Service. This is disconcerting. I mean, a usual run-of-the-mill thug wouldn't be able to do all these things.
That's what I said. It's a tin pot dictator. You go to some, Equatorial Guinea or someplace like that. Yeah, you'll find the dictators do exactly that kind of thing. The prosecutors are quite interesting. I mean, Congress, the Republican Congress, Republicans are not what they used to be. The Republicans used to be a bona fide political party. I've voted Republican in the past. You might like them and dislike them, but they're a political party. No, they're not. They're way off the spectrum. In international comparisons, they are ranked alongside the fringe parties in Europe with neo-Nazi origins. That's the kind of party they are. They're completely in Trump's pocket. They're afraid, they're terrified of him, of his base. They have no integrity. One or two people, Romney, a couple others, are willing to speak up now and then. The others just support him completely. Now, what he did with the executive branch is quite interesting. Had very typical of small-time dictators. Congress, in the days when the Republicans used to be a serious party, under Republican leadership, established inspectors general. Every branch of the executive has an inspector general who supervises it, keeps his eye on it, makes sure there's no corruption, other forms of malfeasance, and so on. That's their job. They were instituted by Republicans. Charles Grassley, senior Republican senator. They started looking into the swamp that Trump has created in Washington, extraordinary corruption. They started looking into it. He fired them. Did the Senate respond? It's a Republican majority. Grassley himself responded. He's the senior Republican. None of them supported him. They said, okay, Trump wants to do it, he does it. Just a couple of weeks ago, he wanted to appoint as the senior Pentagon official in the executive a man named Tata, who's an ultra right-wing guy who's made all sorts of racist, horrifying comments, could never pass even approval by the Republican Senate. So Trump just avoided the approval process, which is constitutionally demanded, and hired him. In fact, he's done that throughout the whole administration. You look at the offices, top offices in the executive branch, very few of them have been ratified by the Senate. Constitution requires that, but Trump got around it by just making them temporary appointments. So again, this is, I'd expect it from Orban, for example. This is tin pot dictatorship. And the Republican Party, or I should say the former Republican Party, is letting him get away with it. And the party faithful, the voters, accept it too. They trust him, they believe him. So a majority of Republicans, considerable majority, I think it's about 3/4, think that he's doing a fine job with the pandemic. The United States is totally off the spectrum. It has 4% of the world's population, 25% of the cases. And just about every other country is doing far better. Europe is opening up. China is almost completely opened up. The East Asian countries are functioning. The United States is a wreck. I haven't been out of my house for 4 months.
Yes, to be honest, it's astounding. It's astounding that after the chaos he created by not recognizing the threat from early on, by not imposing, by not asking the people to wear a mask, by not making it mandatory. It's, for me, it's mind-blowing to see that he still hovers above 42% when it in the polls. I mean, when it comes to approval rates, he is above 40%, and in the polls, Biden is leading by 7-8%, not more than that. And in the swing states, the margins are way smaller. So I think that if you look at how the things are right now, with a little bit of improvement, Trump can still win the elections. And what, as I told you before, what's hard to understand for me is how such an old party, the grand old party, how these institutions, how nobody can stop Trump.
It's quite amazing. For one thing, remember that he's strongly supported by the corporate sector. They're pouring money into his campaign. So the fossil fuel industries, for example, are pouring funds into the Trump campaign. They want to make sure that they still have a few years left to destroy human civilization, which is what they're doing. And they know that if Biden comes in, he doesn't have a terribly strong policy, but he'll cut back their efforts. So it's not that Trump gained support from very central institutions. It is a democratic society, but you have to recognize that over the past 100 years, you can predict who's going to win an election for Congress or president with very high probability just by looking at campaign spending. That variable alone makes an enormous difference. And campaign spending comes from the rich and the powerful. It's one of the miracles of the Sanders campaign was that he broke with this pattern for the first time in over a century, which is quite an achievement. He had no support from private capital, from private wealth. The media were strongly opposed to him. And he practically won the nomination. Came very close. That's an amazing achievement. And it shows that there are things that can be done despite the radical imbalance of power. But you're right, it's a very strong, in fact, they're quite openly, there's nothing secret about this. You can read about it in the mainstream press. The Republican Party today is working out ways in which they can win the election, even if they lose the popular vote, and even if they lose the electoral vote. The techniques, there are a number of techniques being developed. They have to do with things in the Constitution that aren't very precise. You have to bear in mind that democratic societies don't just rest on laws. They rest on good faith and trust. Trust that somebody like Nixon will say, I care more about the country than winning an election. Britain, for example, the Constitution is about 10 words long. The 350 years of parliamentary democracy rely on trust and good faith. And in fact, when Boris Johnson suspended Parliament so that he could ram through his Brexit proposal, it was a huge uproar. First attack on the constitutional order in 350 years. It was in fact shot down by the Supreme Court. But when what Trump is doing is just saying, let's forget all the no good faith, no trust. We'll just use any trick we can. And there are some tricks. What they're planning is, you have to look at the details. The vote is on November 3rd, but the electors vote in December. I think it's December 4th. The governors of the states, in theory, can direct the electors as to what to do. Now, it's never happened, because you assume good faith, but it's theoretically possible. And a lot of the Republicans are Republican. And furthermore, what they can claim is there's something that's called a blue shift. The early voting tends to be higher Republican. The later voting shifts to Democrats. That's the big shift. So the mail votes come in later. They have to be looked at, checked, and so on. And one of the reasons DeJoy is trying to wreck the post office is to make sure that they're contested and they don't come in. But if they do come in and they're counted, they may shift the election to the Democrats. But the Republicans are planning to contest it on the ground that it's illegitimate for that reason. If there's a conflict between what the governors say and what the elections say, it goes to the House of Representatives. Now, the House of Representatives is mostly Democrats, but the Constitution requires that each state gets one vote. So Wyoming, with 500,000 people, gets the same vote as California with 45 million people. Republican, small states happen to be Republican. And that's a way in which, by simply trickery, chicanery, they might maintain their control of the executive branch. And it's perfectly open. It's not secret. They're talking about how they can do this. This is in what used to be a functioning democracy.
Well, I guess I have to hope that this is not going to happen. I mean, I have to hope that Biden is going to win by such a huge margin that Trump won't be able to say anything. And that even if he claims the elections were rigged, the GOP won't get behind him. And I think this is a very important point. If the GOP doesn't get behind Trump, if they're losing the Senate, if they lose votes, they might not get behind Trump. And this might be the end of Trump.
Well, could be, but remember that the Republicans are a minority party, and it's a fading minority. They're mainly a white male party, white male, religious, Christian, evangelical, and rural. And that part of the population is declining. So they know they have no future. They can't win free elections. And if they lose this election, they may be finished.
Mm-hmm.
If they hold on, the Senate used to be called the greatest deliberative body in the world. Under Mitch McConnell and Trump, the Senate has stopped functioning. The way the legislative system works, bills are created in the House of Representatives, sent to the Senate to debate and discuss, and then joint committees make a decision. McConnell just refuses to look at them. None of the House bills get looked at. The Senate does only two things: tax cuts for the rich and appointing ultra-reactionary young justices to fill the entire judicial system in the hope that they can just stuff the the judiciary with so many far-right people that nothing will ever get implemented, no matter what the population wants. If they lose the election, they lose the chance to do that. And they may be finished as this kind of political party. So there's a lot at stake for them. And that's why you see the hysteria at the Republican convention. Just listen to the rhetoric. You know, if we don't win, the country's going to be turned over to radical leftist socialists who want to kill all the whites and turn the country into China or something like that. A big theme of the election is that Biden is under the control of the Chinese. I mean, in any sane country, this wouldn't even be, you wouldn't even laugh. It's so ludicrous. But that's the governing party in the United States. I mean, one of the chief officials like Peter Navarro and Trump himself say, China unleashed the virus against us. Navarro says consciously in order to harm us. I mean,
yeah, it's absurd.
You don't get that even in the wild conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
But that's the mainstream Republican Party.
Yeah, it's absurd and it's outrageous. And now that you've talked a lot about tax cuts and wealth inequality, I would like us to talk a little bit about these matters and the fact that this massive wealth inequality in America, but all over the world, is actually destroying democracy as we see, and it's destroying democracy because it's weakening the social cohesion, because it's reviving xenophobia, and we see it in Poland, for example, in Europe. It's reviving nationalism, religious intolerance, and so on. And in one of your interviews, you discuss an idea, and you quote, I quote you now, this Aristotelian idea. You speak about the dangerous radical Aristotle. And I would like to ask you, because I was always puzzled by that, how come this simple, self-evident idea that you can't have democracy when there are huge wealth disparities in a society? How come this idea seems so strange and so hard to accept for so many who still advocate for free market, capitalism, everybody has to do it on their own, and so on? And what kind of democracy is it that the one we live in? And are democracy and globalized capitalism even compatible?
Well, first of all, let's forget to talk about free market. If we had a free market in the United States, the main corporations would be dead. About maybe almost half the economy is financial institutions. They exist on the basis of government support. It's not just, of course they crash the economy regularly and they get bailed out, but that's only the visible part. Because it's understood in the financial community all over the world that governments are not going to let the big banks fail. The phrase that's used is too big to fail. Mm-hmm. What does that mean? That means they're a safe investment. They can take risky, high profit efforts, and if they collapse, the public will bail them out. They get access to very cheap credit because the credit agencies know they're going to be bailed out by the government. You add all that together, probably amounts to almost all their profit. Actually, the IMF did a study of the 6 major American banks and concluded that their profit depends almost entirely on the hidden government subsidies, both the actual bailouts and just the understanding that they're going to be bailed out, which gives them inflated credit ratings, access to cheap currency, ability to take risky investments, so on. That's a free market. That's almost half the economy. Same with the rest. When in the 1980s, peak of neoliberalism, American manufacturing was declining because of incompetence of American managers. Most of them come from business schools. They used to come from engineering. So you go back over the history of General Motors, the people in charge came out of the engineering department. They were interested in making cars. In more recent years, they come out of Harvard Business School. They don't know what a car is. They know how to make money on the stock market. When these guys got into management positions, the companies began to decline. They couldn't compete with superior Japanese and German competitors. So what did the free market Reagan do? Banned the competitors. They called them voluntary export restraints. Voluntary means do what we say or you'll blast your head off. So under the voluntary export constraints, Japan reduced its exports, gave the American manufacturers a little bit of time to recoup with government aid. I mean, this happens all the time. A free market, just take the World Trade Organization. It's called free market. It's an investor rights agreement. What's called intellectual property rights give exorbitant patents of a kind which have never existed in history to allow monopoly pricing rights to big multinationals. What's that got to do with the free market? I mean, the whole thing is a gag. So it's not free market. It's just policies, or take, say, when Reagan came in, there actually were laws against the use of tax havens, sending your money, like take Apple Computers, the biggest corporation in the world. They pay practically no taxes. The reason is they're an Irish company. They have an office in Dublin, which is probably the size of the room that I'm sitting in. Maybe there's a secretary there once in a while. But since they're an Irish company, they pay Irish taxes, which are very low to try to attack corporations. So they don't pay taxes. The amount of money in tax havens is estimated at maybe 20 or 30 trillion dollars a year, robbing the public, just robs the public. Before Reagan, that was illegal. And the Treasury Department enforced the law. Reagan opened it up. We have to have a free market. Corporations have to be free to rob the public. And so, okay, maybe 20, 30 trillion dollars of robbery of the public. Before Reagan, stock buybacks, just a corporation buying its own stock to inflate it, was illegal. Reagan said, no, free market, they have to be able to do it. The result is, instead of building up the productive capacity of the corporation, you buy stock back to enrich shareholders and management. We see that right now. Corporations are racing to the government to ask for huge subsidies because they're suffering from the pandemic. The amounts that they're asking for are roughly on the order of the stock buybacks since the crash. They didn't use that money to develop the corporation, the productive capacity, pay the workers, educate people, and so on. They used it just to enrich the owners and management. Now they want the public to pay for it. That's called the free market. Okay. But why it's turning out this way? Because those are policy decisions. For example, it was a policy decision to let CEOs, head of a corporation, to pick the panel that determines their salaries. Let's then pick them. Corporations are government licensed, remember. They're not on the free market. They're given a license to operate and given many benefits in order to be licensed. For example, limited liability. Corporation, if you're a shareholder in a corporation, you don't have liability for the crimes that the corporation commits. It's a big advantage for limited. That's the basis for corporate law. And in return for that, they have duties and responsibilities determined by the government, meaning technically by the public.
So
one of them has to do with how the CEO salary is determined.
Mhm.
Reagan changed the rules so that the CEOs could pick their own panel. What do you think happens? CEO's payment goes through the roof.
Yeah.
Not just salary. Most of it's stock options and things. Of course. Now it's gone so far, so high, you can't even see it anymore. It's a large part of the inequality, and that brings up management salaries to compete with it. So sure, you carry out these policies, you get inequality, and then you scream free market, which has nothing to do with it.
So the definition of the free market is actually socialism for the very rich and austerity for the poor, because this is what we experienced like 10 years ago during the financial crisis, and I think this is, as you just said, this is what's happening right now. I mean, once again, the corporations are bailed out, the huge banks are saved. And the costs for all this are paid by the regular people. It's like seeing like living in a time loop. We witness this over and over and over again. How can we stop it? How can we stop it? Is it maybe the fact that this globalized capitalism is destroying the environment? Is this enough to mobilize the people against it? Is this enough to, in other words, is this ecological crisis going to save us somehow? Because we are getting more aware of what's happening, or is it the beginning of the end?
It's one or the other, and the end is not far off. Is it enough? I mean, there's some, like take again the United States, which is the most important, and is the global criminal, the leading global criminal on global warming. Other countries are doing at least something, some quite a lot. Under Trump, the United States is purposely racing to disaster. It's maximizing the use of, just in the last few days, Trump opened up the last huge wildlife reserve
in Alaska
for more drilling, and ended regulations to limit methane release from fossil fuel companies, all of which is lethal for the environment. And he doesn't care. He just wants to make profit tomorrow. But if society doesn't exist in 50 years, it's not his problem. So Trump is racing to disaster. Now take a look at that. There are two conventions going on, Democrat and Republican. Take a close look. See how often global warming has been mentioned. Okay, Republicans, of course, never, because they say it's not a problem.
It's a scam.
How about the Democratic convention? Did you hear a speech about it? Did you hear anybody mention it? It doesn't matter that we're racing towards disaster, and it's not far off. I mean, just the last couple of weeks, we've learned that the ice sheet in Greenland, major ice sheet, has reached a point of irreversible melting. The amount of water stored there would raise the sea level probably 50 meters or something, way beyond anything that human life could survive. Okay, there's still time to deal with it. It's known how to deal with it. Maybe a couple of decades. After that, we're finished.
If you're right, then I'm afraid I can't see the way out of this. I can't see any major country in the Western Hemisphere really mobilizing against global warming. Not even Germany reached. We had an agreement. We had this Paris Agreement, but even those small standards that all countries agreed upon were not achieved by most of the countries. And this is a worrying sign that there's nothing we can do, actually. I mean,
Well, there is. I mean, some of them, like say Denmark, are coming pretty close to zero emissions. Germany's doing at least something. It's still relying on coal, has to get rid of that, but it's doing something. And in fact, most of the world is doing something, and it's known what has to be done. Actually, take China. It's a mixed story. On the one hand, they're still building coal plants, which is destructive. On the other hand, they're way ahead of the rest of the world in solar power, wind turbines, and electrification. And astonishingly, that's what the United States is trying to prevent. It's not just we destroy everything, we try to prevent anyone else from doing anything. There's still time, even in the United States, by no means hopeless. Take the Democratic Party. The Sanders campaign, which is a remarkable phenomenon, as I said, decided to cooperate with Biden to try to influence the program. It was a very wise decision. It's not just entering the campaign, it's the constant popular activism, the banging on doors, the protests, the sitting in congressional offices, all of this just kept up. Well, it turns out that the platform of the Democrats on global warming is nowhere near enough, but it's way better than any that's ever been had. Now, then comes an internal conflict in the party. The DNC is called the Democratic National Committee. That's the Clintonite New Democrats, basically moderate Republicans. They are donor-oriented. So they've managed to chip away at the platform in a pretty dramatic way. Both Biden and Kamala Harris, vice presidential nominee, both of them called for ending subsidies to fuel companies, which is essential. The DNC cut it out of the program because they're worried about the donors who might not like it. So there's an internal battle going on, but at least there's a battle, and the public does have a role. It has managed some effective consequences. It can do more. That's where the hope lies. Same in every other country. The global strike last October, Extinction Rebellion, mostly young people.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of indescribably, I don't know words to find the fact that it's young people who are trying to save the world. Our generation is saying, let's let it all get destroyed. It's irony isn't the right word. I don't know of a word. It's shocking. Yeah, it takes a 16-year-old kid, Greta Thunberg, to talk to the Davos crowd and say, you got to do something.
Professor Chomsky, it's really wonderful talking to you, but I know we have already surpassed an hour. So I have just one more question for you, somehow in line with your last remarks, because I was always astounded especially of your optimism, and it was very hard for me to accept that Bernie Sanders didn't get the nomination. And I think it was very hard for many people who hoped, especially after the first three elections went his way. It was very hard to accept everything. And what I want to ask you is, how do you still have the strength of being optimistic after everything you saw, after everything you witnessed? And do we have a moral obligation of being optimistic, of believing we can change our societies, our worlds for the better?
There's several very good reasons to be optimistic. The one reason actually is history. Despite all we're seeing, over a long stretch, it's a much better world than it was. Things that were perfectly acceptable 30 or 40 years ago are completely unspeakable today. You can't even mention it. I mean, Take the United States, in many ways the most free country in the world. Back when, not even when I was a child, in the 1960s, the United States still had anti-miscegenation laws, which were so extreme that the Nazis refused to accept them. Anti-sodomy laws into this century. Federal laws required segregation in housing that was funded by the federal government. That cut out blacks from the big housing boom in the 50s and the 60s. Okay, the women's rights, radically different. There's lots of changes over the world. It could go on. So that's one reason. The other reason is what you call the moral obligation. We actually have two choices. One is to say, it's pointless, I quit, I'll help making the worst come about. The other is to say, accurately, there are opportunities, no matter how small or how large, I'll grasp them. Maybe we'll make it a better world. There's no choice between those two.
Professor Chomsky, I hope we will both get to live in a better world. I thank you very much for your time. I wish you all the best, and I hope we'll have the chance to meet again.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to talk to you.